Hello and welcome back to MLQ Replay for Week 5 of the 2023 season. I'm Ethan Sturm alongside Nick Jablonski and Jack McGovern. It is holiday week. Happy Canada Day. Happy 4th of July. We are doing things a little differently because of the holidays. This is going to be a recorded episode, a shorter episode. We won't have interviews. We just kind of got this out when we could because, we had two big series going down last weekend. We wanted to make sure we talked about them before we stumble into next weekend, which also has big series to come. We're going to talk about all of it. So we're going to jump right into it, talking about our series of the week down in Texas, a series that a lot of people did not think was going to be particularly close, but that was not the case, especially in game one, which at one point was 110 with a flag runner grab winning the game for either team. And it was veteran Eric Reyes who came down with the grab for Austin to preserve the win. From there, it seemed like the Soldados a little bit more ran out of gas. Game two was 165-50 in favor of Austin. Game three, a comfortable 225-140 win. But again, those flag runner on pitch struggles really hurting Austin. Soldados put up 8 or 9 goals in that period before the Outlaws were able to finally put it away with another grab. Jack, what do you think happened in that game one? How did the Soldados team kind of defy expectations? Sure, not winning the game, but really hanging with this Austin squad.
Yeah, this is an exciting Soldados roster. They have athletes up and down the roster, and they just wanted it more in game one. They were winning every loose ball. They were making every possession count. They were hitting Austin on the fast break. Uh, their beaters hung for a decent portion of the game with this vaunted Outlaws core. So it was just an outstanding effort from the San Antonio squad. A great performance from Jay Stewart. He was their leading goal scorer on the weekend. No surprise there. But just a really impressive showing by the Soldados in game one.
Yeah, it definitely felt like once they knew they were in that game and once they kind of came out firing, they were going to give everything to try to preserve that win. I don't think Jay Stewart subbed out until the 16 or 17-minute mark of that game. A few of their other first liners, like David Avila, who was running around the field and hitting like a truck all weekend, really getting into those driving lanes for Austin, also played a ton of minutes. Blackwood and Sousa did as well. Nick, obviously San Antonio kind of came out in a big way, but did anything about the way Austin came out kind of underwhelm you, or do you think that was a piece of the puzzle for this close game as well, or do you really think it was what San Antonio brought to the table?
I mean, this Austin team looks like a team that already thinks it's 12-0, right? That thinks it's going to be in the finals of MLQ championships right now. It's a team that we know has plenty of athletes and plenty of like a team that didn't want to hit, that was already settled into what they were going to do. And I think that's kind of the risk of this passive offense that they run a lot of the times, where you pass the ball around to the wings and you wait for the most prime opportunity, is it doesn't necessarily let you come out against one of these teams that are going to throw speed and athleticism against you and push the pace a little bit more and play a little bit more up tempo.
Yeah, and obviously the stats really bear out a one-sided situation in the dodgeball game. Jack, you gave credit to San Antonio Beaters. I do think they kind of did their very best to make the most of their situations, where sometimes they were able to help create opportunities for their quad ball players even without control. But it ultimately was one-sided, and yet it sometimes felt like maybe Austin wasn't necessarily taking advantage of that one-sidedness as much as they could have. I'm thinking specifically on defensively, some of their presses still allowed some opportunities for San Antonio. And offensively, it didn't seem like sometimes they had ideas in the half court, even with control. What did you see from Austin in terms of those situations?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a lot of penalties too. This was a sloppy performance by Austin in game one, both beaters and chasers. They had a lot of players in the box. What I saw actually was San Antonio not taking full advantage of those penalty minutes, and Austin really being most effective on the penalty kill. When their backs were against the wall, they kind of tightened up and had a few possessions where they score a player down, which seemed really backbreaking for the Soldados in game one. So I think Austin just has to clean up some of those beater fouls, especially because those penalties are so costly. And then San Antonio has to know how to capitalize on being a player up, and knowing situations, and just uh, recognizing that not every game against a team like Austin is going to be close. And so when you manage to hang, you have to take full advantage, and make sure you get the win.
Yeah, it really did feel like some of those penalty kills were just too free for Austin. Even some of the times where they had multiple people in the box and maybe they'd still manage to get a stop and then still manage to kill a penalty. There were times where like Sa- Austin would have a beater in the box and San Antonio wouldn't even press on defense. They would just kind of wait back, or they would put Austin would put their beaters in the flag runner game, and the San Antonio beaters weren't necessarily still press. But then on the Austin side, we kind of saw a lot of stumblings in flag runner on pitch, which I think is another situational awareness heavy thing. And Nick, you always talk a lot about situations, because that's what a lot of coaching is in quad ball. Obviously, San Antonio's coaching staff's very young, and obviously Austin, Jackson Johnson's a key player for this team. I think when they came out in game two, I think Jackson's first shift was the first 7 or 8 minutes of that game until they were pretty comfortably out front. So, what are you hoping to see more from these teams, specifically in terms of situation management?
I mean, I'd like to see them recognize that they're getting just absolutely burned in these flag runner on pitch situations, and either slow the ball down and decide not to play that, right? Because if you're Austin, trading goals with San Antonio is not the answer, right? You want to be winning that situation, especially with well, Reyes did have a good weekend this weekend. Still a little bit of a question in that flag runner game, right, on how they're going to sort that out going forward. But I think that there just needs to be some recognition so good at, and to struggle with it so drastically this weekend is definitely cause for concern.
Yeah. So my question for you, Jack, is as we're kind of looking at this Austin team, this is a team that I think everyone thinks they're, when we previewed it, and it's not just us that thinks this, everyone thought this team's sweeping the table. This team is winning championships undefeated. The first time that anybody's done that since, I forget, 2018, 2019. I'm blanking on the exact year. Um, does this series give you any further pause than you had before?
Yeah, maybe a little bit. I think I'm pretty high on Austin. I think, like most people, I think, they're the clear favorites. But I was seeing what Nick was seeing. I think they were struggling with the flag runner on pitch to really get anything going offensively. They were extremely dependent on the long range shooting of Josh Johnson, not even mid range shooting. Those are not high percentage shots. Maybe they're high percentage shots for him. It was quite impressive, but I wouldn't necessarily count on that happening again if I were the Outlaws. They gotta incorporate some other ideas in the flag runner on pitch game, and think about ways to bring the beaters into an offensive possession, if only for a second, just to create an advantage for their offense and make sure they're not falling behind in that portion of the game.
Yeah, for sure. And I agree. San Antonio is largely playing just, a 2-2, nothing special, nothing kind of crazy, and not a hoop zone by any means. And at sometimes it just seemed like the Austin offense didn't have particular ideas on how they wanted to attack it. They were just moving the ball around the outside in a box and, hoping something would open up and they would just eventually rip a shot. Um, all that said, a name we haven't, I think, mentioned at all is Miguel Esparza. He got his, and as long as this team has this beater core and is able to get chances in transition, I mean, that's always going to happen. He's always going to get his. And I think 13 goals on the weekend. I mean, that was a lot of the stabilization on their offense when it wasn't, Josh Johnson taking those long range shots, as you alluded to. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, obviously, missing Augustine Monroe, missing Casey Irwin, and that's very very big missing pieces. These are two players who I think have defined the sport for the better part of a decade at this point, and they are definitely going to figure in heavily to this team's MLQ championship roster. So I think that'll all be part of it. Switching over to the San Antonio side, though, Nick, I think a lot of, when we were sketching out in the preseason, when we were high on this Prowl team, who we're going to get to see for the first time on Saturday, I'm very excited about that. And we were sketching out, can this Prowl team be that North team that makes a semifinal run? We're saying hey, one of the nice things is that this year you can win the North and you can select second from the South and possibly, which is, more likely than not at this point going to be the San Antonio team. Do you think that are you more scared of the San Antonio team if you're another top team after this weekend? Or do you think it was more about this, Austin performance?
I mean, Austin kind of played San Antonio straight up in game one. And I don't think that's the way you have to play San Antonio, right? Jay Stewart is that guy when you let him play from behind the hoops. It's that simple. And the thing New Orleans did beautifully for game one, especially, was they just never let Jay Stewart touch the ball in any dangerous spots in game one. They were constantly taking him out of the play. And the rest of these, the gravity of Jay Stewart, if Jay Stewart beats that one on one in the back in this 2-2 zone, and that's constantly what was happening in game one. I think that Chicago is going to be a smart enough team to realize that and recognize that they're just not going to let Jay Stewart play offense from back there. And I think the San Antonio team might stagnate a little bit more, like we saw in that New Orleans series, if that's the case. And I think I'd probably still select them over, say, a Boston or a New York or a Washington, however that all ends up settling out in the range. But I think it's definitely closer now. I don't think it's an obvious choice.
Yeah, and I think the tough thing for San Antonio we've seen in back-to-back series now is their quad ball game is going to have to work so hard to overcome some of these, shortcomings in the beater game. And it's not to say that these beaters aren't solid. I think they're putting in a lot of work, and I think a lot of them are overperforming at times. They just don't have the elite beating that other teams that are beginning playing in the semifinals, for example, have. And honestly, like what this quad ball game has been able to do regardless of that is honestly incredible. I mean, they were eating Austin Outlaws presses of like Team USA beaters and making three passes and getting a shot opportunity. Maybe they didn't hit them all, but I mean that really speaks to how well these players are playing together, how long they've been playing together, especially the UTSA core. But then bringing in other pieces. I mean, Leo Rodriguez had a really nice series. I think David Avila is coming along every single series and becoming more and more of a player. Uh, the thing that scares me is that, as you mentioned, the gravity around Jay, and it does feel like they just need someone else to be a little special on offense when it can't be the Jay Stewart show, and whether that's going to be Molina Sousa, getting hitting more shots, whether it's going to be Blackwood stepping up offensively or Avia stepping up offensively. I think that's what this team really needs to kind of take it over the top because it's a physical team that is playing smart offensively, has ideas, and this team is so young. Like this team is the future of quad ball. And I think it's so exciting. I mean, almost every name we just mentioned is like 23 or younger. It is incredible. And we're talking about whether this team can go to the semifinals of MLQ. I mean, a lot to be excited for about the San Antonio team. Any other points either you guys want to make before we jump over the other series this weekend?
So my thing is I think that the San Antonio team is like one strategic step away, not necessarily even someone being a little bit special, right? I think they're so used to Jay being able to get his that they're not necessarily building an offense for the other players to get easy looks. And the second you start throwing in maybe like a little screen or a tap beat on a wing kind of thing for Milena to get in the lane and hit her shot, uh, this team's going to open up and flourish a lot more. So I think that, and they have plenty of time to install that, right? It's almost 2 months from now until MLQ championships. If they add one little set play for each of these other players or one little idea where they facilitate well, then I think this team gets very scary very quickly.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Ethan said about San Antonio really becoming the center of producing talent in the Southwest, if not the whole country right now. Um, think about where this Austin team would have been without the contributions of former Soldados players, whether it's Miguel Esparza leading the way with 13 goals, whether it's Mel Kite chipping in 4 goals herself, whether it's Eric Reyes catching 2 flags on the series. And for the Soldados, I think we saw their present, which, as you said, is young and extremely skilled. Um, we also saw their future in that game 3. They have some players coming up, especially in the quad ball game. I agree that the beating core is still pretty inexperienced, and I think Chicago is not going to be as troubled by the beaters as they have been in past years. But in that third game, Leo Rodriguez, you mentioned. I'll also throw shout outs to Trevor Smith and Riley Molman with some big contributions to contribute to that comeback. Just very exciting from the Soldados, and looking forward to seeing what they do the rest of the season against their South Division rivals.
Yeah, and even just specifically that UTSA program, because I mean Miguel Esparza came into the sport through that program. Daniel Williams came into the sport through that program. It really is a program that's just been putting out hits for quite a while now, and it's been fun to watch. And hey, they finally got their just desserts with a national championship this year. But yeah, so let's jump over to our other series, a big series up in the north with really large stakes. Toronto versus Rochester. Rochester traveling up. Last year was Toronto traveling down to Rochester. Nick and I were at that one, and Rochester kind of laid the smackdown on Toronto, really set the tone, and took down that half of the division. This year, Toronto returning the favor, 175-60 in game one, 130-105 in game two, and 175-110 in game three. Rochester really hanging around the second two games. A matchup with some big stakes, as you know, with the sweep, Toronto goes to 6-0. They clinch their half of the North Division. They clinch a spot at MLQ Championship, and they clinch a spot in the finals match for the North Division at North Division Championship against either Minneapolis or Chicago or Detroit. Guys, a lot has changed about these rosters within a year, and I think that is kind of part of the story of what happened here. But Jack, what did you see from this Toronto team that maybe you weren't seeing previously?
I saw Brian Melchior, a longtime member of the Raiders program, but I think there were a lot of questions heading into the season about who would step up with Michael Howard no longer in their ball carrying role, and the Raiders needing someone to facilitate and score and take control of the offense. Brian Melchior stepped into that hole. Finished the weekend with a total of 13 goals and 4 assists. Was their most important player. Just in extremely good form. I thought heading into the IQA World Cup going to be a huge contributor for Team Canada this summer, and a real problem for every team that he goes up against.
Yeah, we talked about gravity earlier, and we were talking about Jay Stewart, and Melchior seemed to have that gravity on the field. You know, beating a lot of point defenders, getting into the lane, drawing extra attention, being able to make the pass off of that, or taking it himself. And I did have some qualms about this Toronto offense when he wasn't on the field, but things were really ticking when he was. And sometimes they played him on ball, sometimes they played him behind the hoops. He was able to kind of create or play off ball as needed, and I agree, it was a huge performance for him. 13 goals and 3 assists on the weekend for Melchior. Nick, when we were at that series last season, I mean, the story was really that Rochester's beaters. I mean, Rochester came out physical and everything; they were able to get points, but their beaters outplayed this Toronto core. And it's some changes in the Rochester core, but a lot of similarities in the Toronto side. And this year, it was all Toronto in the dodgeball game. And yes, we finally had the return of Zach McDonald, the long-running joke on this show. But that wasn't the story. The story was the contributions all up and down the roster through the whole depth. Emma Sherwood was the one who led the team in plus minus. Alex Scherzer was the one who led the team in dodgeballs per possession, led the team in stops. And that was all playing limited shifts compared to some of their other beaters. When Toronto kind of returned from that long absence off COVID last year, one thing we talked about is maybe it's just been a long time since they'd seen American beaters. Do you think that's part of the story of what happened and the difference between this year and last year?
I think it's a story. I think it's definitely part of it. I think they needed some time to get up to speed, and a lot of them, when we talked to them after the series, just said like, "This is a different game. This is a different speed than we're used to, even in practice." Right? And to be fair, Rochester's press from last year definitely played into that. Right? It was a hyper aggressive, forced the issue right at half pitch kind of press, and I think that threw them off, and the adjustments they had to make weren't necessarily ready to see that. Um, while we talked about Rochester being a strong beating core, it is a different beating core than it was last year, right? We see the return of some of those names, um, and some of those names haven't played in a while. And while they still maybe some of the part of the country has produced, maybe they're taking the time to get up to speed now. And Toronto coming in with this focus was definitely able to get the better of them this weekend.
Yeah, and obviously Toronto was not playing its first games of the season, and Rochester was. So it's not maybe that surprising that the least close game of the series was the first one, as Rochester's kind of sweeping off some of the cobwebs, and Toronto's already kind of running in form and playing at home. Uh, Jack, obviously a ton of turnover in Rochester's quad ball game this year specifically. A few players that I think were big contributors still around, and obviously Kip Halpor, continues to perform in a big way for this team. I think he's been a breakout player in the last couple of years, 7 goals and 5 assists. But it seems like the rest of the offense is you know has some shortcomings, making some unforced errors, and it seems like maybe they just need a couple more of these young players to step up in a big way for this team. How are you seeing the offense on the quad ball game on the Rochester side?
Yeah, I think that's right. Heading into the season, the big question was how do they replace Bassam Ashkar? How do they replace his ball carrying? Um, and this is a question that the Whiteout faced at MLQ championships last year. Um, and they didn't really have an answer quite yet. Because all season, Ashkar had been feeding Palpor off ball, and Palpor had been cooking on the wings behind the hoops. And Palpor was able to get into some of those positions, also took on some of the ball carrying responsibilities. But I was intrigued by some of the other players that the Whiteout gave a shot to ball carry. There were some growing pains, but I think they're moving in the right direction by giving Mitchell Vargas a chance to ball carry, by trying out uh, Owa Sujiroso at the top of the key, a position that she's played for many years in kind of the equal opportunity whiteout offense, but giving her more of a chance to facilitate from the top. Even Joe Gokowski, I thought had some nice passes. Um, there were good cuts at times. Ben Stonish was good off ball, had a couple key alley. Um, but I think this whiteout team is still trying to figure out what their identity is on offense. 2 years ago, it was very movement oriented. Last year, it was the connection between Ashkar and Palpor. What is it going to look like this year? I think we'll find out more when they play Cleveland in an MLQ North championships.
Yeah, for sure. And you talk about identities, and I think one thing that we talked about last season as well that Los Giros has really done a good job of kind of transitioning this team through is kind of always keeping that identity as a very physical team. And I think that is one thing that I think Rochester can hang its head on this weekend. They really put in the effort. They were physical. They were making all of their hits. They were playing, all of 50-50 balls. Young players, like I thought Sobel Pressman was just kind of all over the place, looked like he was kind of putting in 130% effort to everybody else's 100% effort. It is fun to see. But when you talk about identity, and Nick, I kind of want to ask you a general strategic question that didn't only come from this Rochester team. I was thinking of watching a few games over the last week or so. A weird quirk of the no reset rule is I think it takes some of the value out of shooting from behind the hoops. And I say this because Rochester is a team that has always played in those huge spaces behind the hoops and does love to take those shots. And they were ripping some of those shots this weekend, and a lot of them that missed just became instantaneous turnovers uh, by going across half court, especially on the turf, which they were playing on this weekend, which a lot of major MLQ series are played on. Do you think teams might need to make an adjustment for that fact strategically? Just something to think about with the no reset.
I mean, I think that the difference is right, just from a general strategic standpoint. I think the shots need to be they can't be forced anymore, right? That Rochester program has made a living off of like the Gaminiac shots through three people that just have just so much pace to come through and go behind, right? We need to be looking more for open push shots from behind the hoops, things that allow for a shot at a player keeping it from going over half, right? Whether that's a beater back with a dodgeball stopping the roll legally, or a quad ball player being up top. I think that that's a lot of the case. I think that you can't force shots nearly as much from behind hoops.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely fair. Kind of looking at these teams kind of going forward. Jack, we spoke to Michael Howard a few weeks ago. I think it was before you had joined us for the season. But they talked about keeping their goals like within reason. But they did really want to get through this Rochester series. They do that. They kind of punch their ticket to this finals match. Do you kind of foresee this team? Obviously, Rochester last year was not able to give the team from the other half of the division much of a run in that finals match. Do you think this trial team is going to be able to flip that script at all at North Division Championships?
Yeah, I mean, I'm intrigued. I did listen to that interview. I thought it was a great interview, insightful from Michael Howard. I think when we talk about North Division championships, it's going to be post World Cup, and so a lot of these players are going to be coming off experience playing against the world's best, and they're going to be coming off an experience where they've played with each other. They've gone through the ringer. Um, and I think they're going to be ready to compete, whether it's Chicago, whether it's Minneapolis, whether it's Detroit. Um, they played a tough game against Indy last year, and I think they will most likely be a stronger team this year, have more players, and just be ready to compete at the highest level.
Yeah, and obviously, just making this championships means they finish top two in the North Division. It means they become another team to join the ranks of teams who have made the quarterfinals under the current format, because that will happen automatically. Most likely, based on how we think the stars are going to align, that will mean a quarterfinal matchup against the second place team from the East Division. Obviously, it's not going to be an easy matchup, whoever that does end up being. But hey, I mean, I think that's something, as you said, you can hang your head on. Playing under the lights on Saturday at MLQ Championship. I mean, it's a place where a lot of crazy series have happened. It's a place where a lot of interesting things have happened. So I think just getting there, is a big feat. For this Rochester team, Nick, obviously a lot of work now to do. We've kind of seen the ringer of the North Division Championship of trying to get one of those remaining couple of spots. You definitely don't want to be one of the two teams who has to win two in a row, which is the teams that finish third in their half of the division. So it kind of comes down to this Cleveland series. How do you think this Rochester team is going to stack up there and going forward at North Division Championship?
So I was thinking about this morning, and I think this Rochester team on paper is probably better than this Cleveland team, but I don't think it's that much better. I think it's if they come in to this series, and it is a home series for them, which is nice, which is good for them. Rochester does play very well at home, but I do think that this is one where they could drop a game or two, just based off the way they play and what they're starting to figure out. And we saw this Cleveland roster give this Toronto roster a very tough game one. So I think that it's going to be a very interesting series and one that definitely I'll be excited for at the end of July.
Yeah, and last year at North Division when it was Cleveland versus Detroit in that third place game, we talked a lot about all the familiarity between those two rosters. This Rochester and Cleveland series has a lot of that as well. I mean, assistant coach Jack Mosley for Cleveland has played for Rochester. Assistant coach Fiona Gaffney for Cleveland played at the University of Rochester with half of the team that is on this Rochester squad. So there are a lot of people who know a lot of people. Familiarity always breeds close games. It's one of our favorite phrases around here. So, I think it's going to be an intense one. And it'll be interesting because I really think, like I said, you want to be that second place team. I do think, though, when all is said and done, both these teams are going to struggle to beat Detroit out for that last spot if it were to be Detroit, or if it were to be Chicago. I think the same way. But that's all left to be discovered. I think there's a lot of interesting games left to be played in the North Division. Does anybody have any other points they want to add before we jump off of this series? Awesome. All right. Well, that is going to do it for us tonight. Thanks for tuning in for our abridged version. Like I said, we wanted to get something out to you guys this week because there is so much going on right now in MLQ. This week coming up, series of the week Chicago versus Minneapolis. Chicago, the last team to start their season, maybe the team we're most hyped up to see because there's just so much difference in this team. Obviously, new city, new roster, new players, new stars, new coach, and they're taking on right away the two-time defending division champions. I know there are people keeping track of just how long it's been since this Chicago core has beaten this Minneapolis core in an MLQ game. They're looking to change it at their first ever home game in Chicago. It's going to be a lot of fun. Jack's going to be there. I'm pretty jealous, but I will definitely be tuning in. We also just want to shout out once again our Patreon. Check it out. The fourth episode of Cuts by Neves dropped 2 days ago. We're on the weekly schedule now. So next week maybe is the episode where we talk about the first match, or maybe it's the one after that. But either way, you don't want to miss it. Nick is still running the breakdown on there as well, and we'll definitely be breaking down something from the San Antonio versus Austin series. So please definitely consider it. It goes a long way to help us kind of fund what we're able to do with digital media, with our series of the week, with our championship setups, etc. So it does mean a lot. For myself, for Jack, and for Nick, we want to thank you again for watching. Happy Canada Day. Happy 4th of July. This weekend, huge series of the week. And then we'll see a lot of you as well at the IQA World Cup the week after that. It's going to be an absolutely crazy month of quad ball, and we're excited to be here with you. So thanks for watching, and everybody have a good night.